The kindness was never the problem. That is the part that takes the longest to understand. You were not too much. You were too readable. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world with a genuine openness, an instinctive willingness to give without keeping score, to stay without being asked, to soften situations that did not deserve that softness. And there are other kinds of people who encounter that openness and make a quiet, unconscious calculation. Not malicious, not even fully deliberate, simply opportunistic in the way that all humans become when resistance is absent and access is easy. Your kindness was not misread. It was read correctly, as availability, as reliability, as a resource that did not appear to have limits. The cold that came later was not who you became. It was what you finally understood. There is a particular kind of person who gives without condition, not out of naivety, but out of genuine depth. They make space. They extend patience. They absorb difficulty without complaint and offer warmth without calculation. And for a long time, this feels like integrity. It feels like the right way to move through the world. What they do not yet see is what the people around them are learning, slowly, unconsciously, without malice about what their presence costs. When a person never enforces a limit, never signals that their energy is finite, never allows the natural friction of self-preservation to enter a relationship, something shifts in the psychology of those receiving them. Not a conscious decision, not cruelty. Simply the quiet recalibration that the human mind makes when it encounters something that has never once pushed back. It begins to assume the supply is permanent. This is not a moral failure in others. It is a mechanical reality of how the psyche allocates attention and care. The mind, when given no resistance, defaults not to gratitude but to consumption. What is always available becomes over time what is never prioritized. The person who is always there gets reached for last because the assumption is that they will always still be there. Their kindness, genuine as it is, has been quietly reclassified, not as something earned or remarkable, but as something environmental, like air, present, unacknowledged, taken without thought, because no thought was ever required to access it. The tragedy is not that people are ungrateful. The tragedy is that structureless generosity teaches, through pure repetition, that no structure is necessary. What cuts deepest, when this finally becomes visible, is not the behavior of others. It is the realization about one's own. The moments of giving that felt like love. The patience extended past exhaustion, the grace offered past its natural limit, the loyalty that asked nothing in return. These were real. The feeling behind them was real. But the lesson they transmitted was not the one intended. Every moment of unconditional availability, quietly communicated, there is no threshold here. There is no point at which this ends. And when something has no threshold, it does not inspire reverence. It does not inspire care, or reciprocity, or the instinct to protect. It inspires traffic. People pass through open doors. They do not pause at them in gratitude. The grief that follows this understanding is a specific kind, quiet, slow, and difficult to articulate. It is not the grief of betrayal, because most of the people involved were never villains. It is the grief of having been someone's resource without ever knowing that was the role, of having given what felt like intimacy and having it received as convenience, of realizing that what you experienced as devotion, they experienced as a feature of the landscape, something they noticed only once it was no longer there. That absence is often the first moment your presence registers with full weight. Not when you were giving, when you stopped. Softness in itself is not the problem. Softness without architecture is. There is a version of kindness that holds shape, that gives genuinely but not endlessly, that remains warm but not weightless, that extends grace without erasing the quiet signal that grace has its own gravity. That version of softness does not diminish others, it orients them. It creates the natural friction that keeps a relationship honest, the subtle awareness that what they have access to is not infinite, not guaranteed, not a permanent feature of their environment. That awareness is not manipulation. It is the condition under which real appreciation becomes possible. Without it, even the most genuine love becomes invisible. Not because it was insufficient, because it arrived without the one thing that makes anything valuable, the possibility that it could be withheld. What most people call exploitation rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with the simple neurological fact that human beings calibrate behavior based on feedback. When a person consistently absorbs, accommodates, and continues offering warmth regardless of what is returned, the surrounding environment does not respond with gratitude in proportion to the giving. It responds with expansion. The demands grow not because the people making them are calculating, but because no boundary has appeared to interrupt their momentum. There is no conscious decision to take advantage of the kind. There is only the quiet, reliable absence of a signal that would have forced recalibration, the moment of friction that communicates without cruelty and without performance. This is the structural truth beneath the experience. So many quietly generous people eventually face. Their character was never the problem. Kindness is not a vulnerability, but kindness without legible edges produces a particular perceptual distortion in others. A distortion where the person who gives the most is seen not as someone who has much to offer, but as someone who has no defined center to protect. And a person without a visible center is not perceived as generous. They are perceived as available. The distinction is crucial because one invites respect and the other invites consumption. And from the outside at a certain distance, they can look nearly identical until something finally breaks. The painful recognition that arrives, often slowly and too late, is this: being deeply kind and being deeply seen are not the same experience. For years, a person can offer one while quietly hoping for the other, extending softness, patience, presence, operating on an unspoken logic that if they give enough of themselves, others will eventually look closely enough to understand what they are. But people do not look closely at what appears boundless. They do not examine water for depth before they drink. The assumption of availability replaces the need for understanding, and the kind person is left in a strange position, fully present, rarely witnessed. What this is not, however, is an indictment of the kind. It is a structural observation about perception, about the way limits, paradoxically, are not what reduce a person's value in the eyes of others. They are what establish it. Visible edges do not diminish warmth. They give warmth a location. They tell the surrounding world, this generosity is chosen, not compelled. This presence is given, not leaked. And a gift that is clearly chosen carries entirely different weight than a resource that simply never runs out. The person who finally understands this does not become harder. They do not close. What shifts is subtler than that. An internal reorganization so quiet it barely registers as change. They simply stop confusing the absence of refusal with the presence of love. And in that small, unhurried distinction, something that had been invisible about them finally becomes real. There is a specific kind of person who gives for a long time without condition, not because they are naive exactly, but because they hold somewhere at their core a working theory about human beings, that people are worth the extension. That generosity compounds. That warmth offered openly will, in time, be met with something close to what was given. This theory is not foolish. It is in many cases the product of genuine care and an interior life rich enough to believe others are operating with similar depth. And then, incrementally, the evidence accumulated, not in a single rupture, but in a series of small, almost imperceptible moments where the theory fails to hold, where the extension is taken without acknowledgement, where the warmth is absorbed and not returned, where the person on the other side of the giving reveals, slowly and without malice, that they are simply not paying the same kind of attention. And at some point, not dramatically, not all at once, the giving stops, not because love died, because the policy changed. What others observe as coldness is, from the inside, the first fully autonomous decision this person has made about their own energy. For years, the generosity was almost reflexive, shaped by disposition, by early patterns, by the belief that withholding care was a form of cruelty. And so they gave, even when the return was silence, even when the dynamic was asymmetric in ways they could feel but hadn't yet named. The turning happens when the naming finally occurs, when what was felt becomes understood. And with understanding comes a quiet, significant shift in internal policy. Not punishment directed outward, but protection extended inward, perhaps for the first time. The guilt that follows is real, and it is worth examining. Because the guilt does not belong to the new version of this person. It belongs to the version that gave without boundary and then felt responsible for the cost of that giving. That version was not wrong to be generous. It was simply unprotected. And what it built through all of it was eventually enough evidence to know that protection is not the opposite of love. It is the condition under which love remains sustainable. The philosophical distinction that matters here is not between warm and cold. It is between open and finished. A person who is turned is not closed to the world. They are closed to a specific pattern of engagement that proved over time to be extractive without reciprocity. The warmth did not leave. It became selective, more deliberate, offered now from a position of knowledge rather than hope. And if that looks like coldness to someone standing outside it, someone who benefited from the earlier, less guarded version, that observation tells you more about what they lost than what this person became. The turning was not cruelty. It was the boundary that should have existed from the beginning, arriving late, intact, and entirely self-generated. Not everything that hardens is broken. Some things harden because they are finally and for the first time complete. There is a pattern that emerges quietly in the aftermath of transformation, one that is equal parts clarifying and unsettling. The person who was once generous with their time, their attention, their emotional availability, and received in return a kind of casual indifference, that same person, after recalibrating, after becoming quieter and harder to reach, begins to notice something unexpected. People lean in, not the same people necessarily, and not always for the right reasons, but the quality of attention shifts. The interest becomes more deliberate. The interactions carry more weight. Nothing about their core changed. Their values, their intelligence, their capacity for depth remained intact. What changed was their availability, and that single variable altered how they were perceived, more profoundly than years of openness ever had. This is not a comfortable realization. It sits uneasily, because what it implies about human psychology is something most people prefer not to examine directly. The mind does not assign value uniformly. It assigns value in proportion to effort, to the resistance encountered, to the interiority it cannot immediately access, to the presence it must work to be near. The person who was always available was not overlooked because they were ordinary. They were overlooked because they required nothing. And the human psyche, almost without exception, moves toward what challenges its perception rather than what confirms it. Depth that is immediately accessible does not register as depth. It registers as surface, abundant, generous, and therefore unremarkable. What makes this realization bittersweet, rather than simply painful, is the specificity of what it reveals. Not about others in general. So amorkable take two, to enter reveal coral, but about the particular relationships that were invested in most heavily. The recognition, the closeness, the quality of genuine attention that had always felt just out of reach. It was not withheld because of anything lacking. It was withheld because the conditions under which it tends to emerge were never present. Full openness rarely produces the kind of connection that selective presence does. Not because people are cynical or manipulative in their attachments, but because accessibility and perceived value operate in quiet opposition inside the human mind. What is rationed is studied. What is studied is understood. What is freely dispensed is consumed without examination and rarely returned with equivalent care. The people who appear after the change, who suddenly find the recalibrated version compelling, who express interest in understanding someone they previously took for granted, are not necessarily disingenuous. Some of them are simply responding to something real that was always there but became visible only when it stopped being automatic. That distinction matters, because it separates the ones worth allowing back into proximity from the ones who are simply drawn to unavailability as a concept, who would lose interest again the moment access was restored. The difference is perceptible, with enough stillness to observe it clearly.